What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I do the weathering on my Keratin overlords, my Junkforce overlords. We're going to be doing this in a couple of different steps. The first is we're going to be using our acrylic paints to add a bit of chip weathering and some highlighting to these chips. We're then going to basically switch over almost entirely to oils, where we do a combination of washes and filters to do the panel lighting, the color modulation on the armor of the models, as well as adding some rust and grime, before finishing up with weathering powders to add a bit of a soft, dusty feel for the desert ambience or environment that we want the army to have. So the materials you're going to need for this are obviously your acrylic paints. So for this example, because I'm painting a green engine rigger, so I'm using burnt red from Vallejo as my chipping. We're going to use a couple of different greens depending on how bright or dark the green armor is for the model for the highlights. So I'm using scale colors Arati green and spring green. And then on the lighter part of the armor over where it's closer to white, I'll be using Vallejo's ivory for the highlights. We're also going to need some blister foam pack to apply our chip weathering. And I also have some squeeze to open tweezers just to hold the foam to make it a little easier for myself. And then for the oils, I've got a couple of colors. For the panel lining, I'll be using black and sort of a dark brown. This is Van Dyke Brown from Van Gogh. And then for my rust and weathering, I've got burnt sienna and yellow ochre. We'll have a couple of palettes and containers for our oil washes. And then of course, we're using just your typical mineral spirits. I'm using a brand name from Desserts, which is their odorless solvent called Taltine. It functions exactly the same as turpentine. It's essentially a mineral spirit for oils. It'll help dilute the paint as well as we used for cleaning our brushes. For the weathering powders, I'll be using Vallejo's dark yellow ochre, which I also use on the bases of the models. This will help tie it all together and just reinforce that desert ambiance. So as I mentioned, the first step we're going to be doing is the chip weathering. And so we're just going to tear off a piece of foam. What we're really looking for is a rough texture on the foam or a rough surface that'll be used to apply the chip weathering. You don't want it too even. If it's a little too clean of a break, you can sort of tear off pieces of it just to add a bit more surface texture. We want something very rough, and when it sponges, it's going to give us a nice and uneven pattern to the color. So if I can show you. So what we're looking for is this spotting. So if you do a few test sponges, we're looking for this sort of texture. So taking our model, I already have some of the burnt red on my palette, and we're just going to apply the weathering. And I'm really focusing on surfaces where I'm expecting the armor to be battle damaged either from incoming fire or attacks, and more just surfaces that I expect to receive wear and tear from use. Now, normally I would do the weathering before painting all of the details. So I've done the green, I'll do the weathering, and then I'll do everything else like the metallics and all the details. But for the purposes of recording this tutorial, I've painted everything on the model first. So I'm going to be a little more careful with the sponging, and then I may actually have to go in with a brush to hand paint some of the sponge weathering around the other painted elements. And that's the chip weathering done in the model. You can see I've focused a lot of my weathering more towards the bottom and then primarily around the front where I expect a lot of the enemy attacks are going to be coming in from. I've also added a bit of wear and tear on the cupola where I expect him to constantly have his arms, as well as focusing some heavy weathering on the stepladder where he's going to be walking up and down the little tank thing, and then on the top hatch where the paint will chip from it opening and closing. So with the weathering done, we're now going to go back in and we're going to highlight some of our bigger chunks. And for that, we're just going to be using our light greens and our ivory, and we're just going to be painting very fine lines on the bottom, opposite to where I expect the light to be. So my light source is going to be coming in from here. So depending on where the weathering will be, I'm going to be highlighting the chips appropriately. Now, I don't think you need to highlight every chip that you've applied to the model. I'm only really focusing on the big ones that I expect to be deeper. The smaller ones are more surface scratches or just minute details, I'm not going to weather. I don't want to imply that they're all super deep cuts. Now that we've done all of our edge highlights, it's time to move on to the next step of using oil washes to do our panel lining and our color modulation. So for the panel lining, what I'm really looking to do is just define where a lot of these different armor plates and these crevices are. And we're going to use a combination of our black and dark brown oils mixed together to create our oil wash. So what I usually do is I have one container in the center that's going to have my clean mineral spirits. And this is for cleaning and washing my brush. As it gets dirty, it gets cycled out and I cycle in new mineral spirits. I have all of my different little color wells on the sides for all of my different oils and oil washes that I go, and I'll just go in a circle as I go through the different steps. Now, for larger models, I usually do recommend doing a gloss varnish or a few coats of gloss varnish to help break the surface tension and make it easier to apply the oils and to tweak them afterwards. But for small models like these, especially that don't have large surfaces or where I'm mostly focusing on streaks and grimes, I'm not as concerned about having to go back and tweak. I can still go back with clean mineral spirits afterwards, and it's usually still fairly easy to erase little pieces or to adjust after the fact. So I'm okay skipping that step for these models. And I just go straight from the acrylics right to the oils. And you can see how even without the gloss varnish, the capillary reaction of the oils into these crevices is still sufficient enough to get the colors to where I need them. And the staining actually works in my favor because it helps to modulate the color and add a little bit more textural detail to the surface, so it isn't just that flat green. I'm okay with the oils being a little messy at this stage. And we're just going to go around the entire model and we're going to black line all of the armor plates and crevices. And that's the black lining done. I'm fairly subtle with this at this stage. You can go heavier by having less of a dilution or more of the oil paint, and going back for a couple of extra steps to really define the edges. I want this to be a relatively soft look, so I just want a very subtle black lining to the model. And from here, we're not going to wait for the oils to fully dry. I want some of that mineral spirits already on the surface of the armor. And this is going to help sort of prepare the surface for our next step of color modulation. To do the color modulation, we're mainly going to be using our burnt sienna and yellow ochre as sort of dot washes on the surface. So you can see, even though I've prepped a lot of the paint in the color palette, because I'm going to be using these in sort of heavier washes and filters later on, I'm not going to dilute all of it. I'm just going to take a bit of the oil paint and a bit of mineral spirits to create my first wash. And with the wet surface, I'm just going to add a bit of color and let the, again, capillary reaction pull the color just sort of in uneven streaks and blotches across the surface. I'm going to refine certain spots of the model, particularly where I want certain washes to pull up, like in some of these crevices, or if I want some streaking with the vents. And really the goal is just to break up the color of the surface. So rather than having a flat, off-white pastel green to a darker green blend, by adding in these color modulations, we're able to add just a little bit of extra detail, that little extra bit of realism to the model without much effort. And of course, with the surface being wet already from our black lining, this helps to pull some of the color. You just want to be careful not to have too wet of a wash, especially in some of the crevices where it's going to pull the initial brown and black mix. It can get a little muddy, just be careful. Or alternatively, you can wait the day or two for the first wash, the black liner, to dry, and then proceed to this next step. With the color modulation done, we're now going to move on to using heavier oil applications to apply our rust and our grime. And this is where we get the really cool streaking effects applied to some of our chip weathering, as well as some of our rivets and our battle damage. So we're taking the burnt sienna in a heavy application, and we're just going to now you can see that as we are applying it to the model, because there is still some mineral spirits from our color modulation, it's helping us to apply this and be able to pull this out to fade it very naturally. And we're just going to slowly apply this over the rest of the model. And the oil is fairly forgiving at this stage. Using clean mineral spirits, we're able to fade and pull and push the color around. And at this stage, I also like to take some really heavy burnt sienna and start dotting it into the center of some of the larger chips. It is a fairly bright color when applied heavily, so it's a cool way to add a little bit of extra color, and then I can, once I've dotted it, using some clean mineral spirits, pull it down. And I'm doing this all over the entire model, just taking my time and having fun with it. And once this stage is done, we're going to move on to the last step of our oils, and that's going to be using a pretty heavy yellow ochre wash to add or to create this like settled dust effect. You can see like at the top of this armor panel, just where dust would just collect into these crevices from all the storms and all the weather in the environment. And we're really going to take advantage of both the capillary action of the oils as well as how the oil pigments will settle once the mineral spirits will evaporate. So we're just going to take our yellow ochre with a pretty heavy-handed wash. Not too diluted, just enough to allow the mineral spirits to help the paint flow. And we're just applying it to areas that we feel we want to have heavy dust settling. You'll see that once this step dries, the ochre is going to be very concentrated in some of these pockets and really create that illusion of dust collecting. So you can see that as the oil starts to dry and the mineral spirits evaporates, it's leaving these heavy concentrated pigments or pockets of yellow pigment. Now, if you find that it's a little too heavy or you want to just go back and correct it a little bit, you can go back in with some mineral spirits and just gently erase some of the excess pigment. And really the pigments are going to stay workable for quite a while, at least a few hours, before it starts to set, and really then only the heaviest applications of our ochre and sienna will still be able to be picked up. And that's it. That's all we're really doing for this model. The last step is to apply some soft weathering powders. I'm mainly going to be concentrating on the bottom of the model where it's going to be kicking up a lot of dust. However, the oils are going to take quite a while to dry, probably at least a day or two. So at this point, I'm sort of just stuck on this model. There's not much I can do until the oils are dry and I can apply a seal, a varnish, and then touch up my final highlights and add the weathering powders. So that's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna set this aside to wait for a few days and then we'll come back to it. So now that the oils are fully dried, we're going to return with some acrylics and we're going to touch up our highlights. I'm gonna go back in focusing mainly on the yellow panels because I want them to pop a little bit more. And then the metallics. I'm gonna go back in and highlight the yellow with scale color Tenaire yellow. And for the metallics, I'm going in with Vallejo Air Chrome. This is a very reflective paint and it's going to give the metal that last pop to really sell the metal. So with the edge highlighting done, we're just gonna go back in with our final step. We're gonna use an old dry brush and then we're going to just dust on a bit of pigment powder onto the bottom of the model. And then I might concentrate a little bit on the step ladder. So using an old brush, anything will do, just as long as it's dry. Dryness is the key. And once again, we're using Vallejo's dark yellow ochre pigment. And we will use this same powder on the base as well. So with the pigment powder applied, we're now going to go to our final step and just spritz on a little bit of mineral spirits. You don't want too much, we're just looking to lightly fix it to the surface before we apply our dull coat. I'm only going to spritz where I have applied the powder. It's just very lightly focusing around the lens, the base, and the ladder. As always, when you're fixing pigment powders, it is going to knock back some of the strength of the powder. This one, not so much. So what you want to do is you want to make sure you apply the powder a little more heavily. And then if the final effect after you've fixed it isn't to your liking, it's not enough, then you might want to go back in, or you might have to go back in and add more powder and then fix it again. Before we can dull coat the model, this will take a few hours for the mineral spirits to fully evaporate. So once again, we're going to set this aside to dry and we'll come back in a few hours. And with the mineral spirits having fully evaporated, you can see that the weathering powder has set. It's not quite as strong as when we first applied it, but it's got a very nice, soft, subtle feel to it that I really, really like. It's not too strong, and most importantly, it's going to handle well as a tabletop gaming piece. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to take some Games Workshop Purity Seal, and we're just going to go ahead and spray varnish this model and then glue it onto the base. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome weekly content. You can also follow my Instagram at SirJohnTheHo for daily updates on my hobby projects. Until next time, happy hobbying.